Well, good morning, everyone. Wonderful to see you this morning on this beautiful summery day. We have, I don't know whether you know it or not, but summer has arrived. Yesterday it was something like 93 in the shade, but what do you expect? Well, prayer requests, burdens and blessings. Good to see the divines here this morning. What a blessing. They drift in from time to time. It's been too long since they were here before. Okay, prayer requests, anybody? Mr. Bettenhausen is giving you a handout. I've had a number of questions about this, and had a question from Miss Petty last week concerning this, because she's a teacher. Miss Petty was the teacher par excellence and worked here for many, many years. And here she comes, and I'm talking about her. But she gets deep into things, and I sometimes hit things on the surface. And I'll make a statement, give some statistics, and go on. And I've had several of you that have come to me and said, would you slow down on some of this stuff? So I'm giving a handout today, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, but basically someone mentioned to me about lowering the screen and doing all the PowerPoint stuff, and I said I would have to get my grandkids here to do that. I can't. A lot of people do. Prayer request. Anybody? Okay, yes, ma'am. As most of you know, Brother Ken Reed had a situation where he had to be hospitalized for a night. He had a bleeding ulcer, and he spent the night in Park West, and they had to go in and fix it. And thank you, sir. It's the balance. But he's doing much better. His cataract surgery got canceled. All right. Anyone else? As you well know, this next week we'll close out the academy, and the week after that we start camp. We start camp this year, the 3rd, I think it's the 3rd of June. We actually got out of school a week later than we normally do and started camp a week earlier than we normally do. So this next week is going to be one more busy week. Everything closing, opening, and starting, and they had this activity out at the camp yesterday where the parents played the young people, and they had 5 teams, and I think one team's had about 12 on it, so there was well over 75 people out at the camp in the middle of the hot, boiling sun in the afternoon. Paramedics were called twice, ambulances showed up. It was awful. Okay, Mom Jean.
Remember Mike Allen lost his wife this week. Ruby Allen, she was 67, died suddenly. That's Chris Allen's brother.
Okay. Also, we have been praying for H.L. Patterson's grandson. His name is what, Paulette? Tyler. As most of you know, Tyler's wife had a situation where she had to have a lung transplant when she passed away the day before yesterday. 37 years old. Praying for that family. Anybody else prayer requests this morning? Well, let's pray together. Our Father, how grateful we are to you for so many things. When we start thinking about how good you are to us and the blessings that you consistently give to us and how you daily load us with benefits, our hearts are large to think about all of these things that we have today. Lord, we would not forget today to pray for all of the classes that are meeting, for our pastor today as he speaks, for the day that young people that came in on the buses, the calls even that we got from some of the young people this morning early on, wanting to make sure that the bus did not go by them and they missed getting to come to Sunday school. Pray your blessing on the day. Thank you for all of the blessings that you give to us. I pray for these requests that have been given. Pray particularly for Tyler and his family, and the homegoing of his wife. Touch, we pray, our lives today and make us conscious of your presence. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, Sunday school class offering. If you'd like to give to that, we have Miss Mary's telling me somewhere up around $1,400. Have what? Okay, she's going to look, and we are buying a commercial refrigerator for the fellowship hall. Great. Hey, that's too much money to give them. $1,800. All right. We'll talk about that. Miss Petty brought up a topic to talk to me about a topic that we discussed a week or so ago concerning the land of Israel and the fact that now it's called Palestine, or some people call it Palestine. And did you do your research on it? You didn't do it, see? Well, I did. And I'm going to read you, and I don't want to bore you today because we're talking about God's plan and purpose for the ages. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about humanity in general and the fact that God created man as the apex of his creation. And then after he created man, after several hundred years, you remember every thought and imagination of man's heart was only evil continually. The Bible tells us in the first, about chapter 5 of the book of Genesis. So Usher's chronology, and most people think it's somewhere around 2,000 years went by, and man was not approaching God. We talked about this matter of the dispensations and how you had the dispensation of innocence in the garden. Adam walked with God in the cool of the day. And then you had the dispensation after they were cast out of the garden of conscience, and we still have that today. I'm not like Schofield. You have a Schofield Bible, I'm sorry, he's wrong on this. He cubby holds the dispensations too much to me. The dispensation of conscience is still going on. Every dispensation begins with a covenant and ends with a judgment, but the judgment for the dispensation of conscience, in my opinion, will be the tribulation. And that's because after Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, actually after they sinned, they realized they were naked, they ran, they hid themselves, so there was something activated in them that made them conscious of right and wrong, and we call that the dispensation of conscience. It's still going on today. And then after the dispensation of conscience, man still, because of his conscience, even though he has a conscience, he did not turn to God. And so God gave the flood. And it was a worldwide flood. This has been one thing that the liberals have contested over the years, and some have even said there was a flood, but it was a local flood. Now you can't have a local flood, not and have the water rising, I forget how many cubits high above the top of the highest mountain. I always think about this the cartoon character BC and how they had this little fellow that was always making water balls. He was down the stream making water balls. You can't make water balls. Water seeks its own level. So if we have a flood on the top of this hill up here, 20, 30 feet above the top of this hill up here, trust me, most of Athens is going to be underwater. Well, anyway, it was a worldwide flood, and I'm not trying to prove it to you. I just want you to accept it. And then after the flood, you have in the flood is starting in chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then after the flood, God gave a dispensation, basically beginning with a covenant called the Abrahamic covenant, and this dispensation called dispensation of promise. So what God did was he reached down into the sphere of humanity and he scooped out one man and made a nation out of it. And this nation was to provide the revelation to the rest of humanity. And we're talking about God's plan and purpose for the ages. The rest of humanity would understand through the nation of Israel monotheism. We would have the Bible in our hands, and we would have the Messiah as a result of this nation. And he pulled Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldees, the Mesopotamian valley, and he sent him down into a land. And this is what we were talking about the other day. Now, this was about 1500 BC, I believe, somewhere along that. The first of the Bible was written around 1440 BC. So about 1,500 years before Christ, you have Abraham, and we know Abraham was the founding father of the nation of Israel. I'm not trying to bore you this morning, but I think it's important that we understand. In fact, I was looking at these dispensations, and the first few of the dispensations deal with all of humanity, and then you have at least 3 of them that deal specifically with the nation of Israel. And it's because God has taken that nation and pulled that nation out. And he gave to the nation 3 things, you remember. He gave a blessing. He said, I'm going to bless you. And this, of course, this Abrahamic covenant was an unconditional covenant. God said, I'm going to bless Israel regardless of what they do. That's what it means to be unconditional. Dispensation of the law was conditional. You do this, I'll do this. But the dispensation of promise, God said, I'm going to bless you, but then he also said, I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to bless all the nations that bless you. And this is one of the reasons why I believe God smiled so on America, is because we are the chief. Israel is our chief ally. We are their chief ally. And then he says, in these shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And he also said, I'm going to curse those who curse you. And so you find any nation has ever raised its hand against Israel is on the rubble of the floor of history. But God gave this nation of Israel, and I've given you, did you get, everybody get one of these? Everybody get one of these? I don't know if you can see it or not on this, because we had talked about back in the book of Genesis, chapter number 12, then chapter 15, then chapter 17, he outlines the area or the land that Abraham will have as a nation. Do you see where it, of course, if you look at, find Jerusalem. You see Jerusalem? You see how that is dark? That is a little area in there that's dark, dotted. Do you see that? The darkest dotted area? That's where Israel is today. That's all of the land that they possess. It's not as big as New Jersey. Now, if you'll look to the right of that, you'll see where the Dead Sea is. You've got the Sea of Galilee at the top and the Jordan River that runs down and it runs into the Dead Sea. But you see where the light dotted area is? Does everybody see that light dotted area? That area is what was promised. Now, as we all know, Abraham, the nation of Israel, never occupied all of that. They do not to this day occupy all of that. But if they did occupy all of that today, they would have the biggest portion of Jordan. They'd have almost all of Syria. They would own Iraq all the way down almost to Kuwait. In other words, the top border of the nation of Israel would be about 200 miles across, and there would be about, on mine it's not real clear, but it's about 350 miles from north to south. And the bottom boundary of Israel, if it got all that God intended for it to have in the book of Genesis, would be about 850 miles across. Now, there's a lot of difference between that if you look at Israel over on the other, what really Israel has now. It's not much more than, I think it's a little over 100 miles. I can't remember exactly, but I've given those stats to you. It's a little, I don't remember now. It's not much more than 100 miles from the bottom of Israel all the way to the top of it. And at one point, it is so narrow until it is only about 20 miles. Now, I've been to Israel before. We flew into Tel Aviv, which is up above Jerusalem. And I've been all the way down to below the Dead Sea area. And it's an amazing place. And if you ever have an opportunity to go to Israel, I would highly recommend it. I've gone one time. I'll go again in the millennium, but I'm not going to go back over there. It's scary, particularly if you get into the Jerusalem area. Now, if you get up around the Sea of Galilee, it's as tranquil as a baby lamb. But you can feel the tension as you get down and around Jerusalem. You see a couple walking along on a date holding hands, and both of them have an Uzi strapped to their back. Their militia is on constant alert. So the guy that was our guide, his name was Ami Levy, and had served in the army. The way they do it there, they have 2 years of active service for both men and women. And then they go into the reserves, and they're in the reserves the rest of their lives. And so anyway, we were running the rabbit trail. But I thought this would be interesting for you to have. You can see the Euphrates River that runs, what would it be, northwest to southeast. And above that is the Tigris River. And the area, that's where, if you come up the Euphrates River, right up above where Iraq is almost to Syria there. That's where Babylon was located, and that's where this area between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River is called the Mesopotamian Valley, or the Shinar Valley. And this is where Abraham came from. If you look over to about the middle of the map, you see where Beirut, you see where Damascus is? Damascus is purportedly the oldest city in the Middle East. And so when Abraham came across from the Ur of the Chaldees, he came down into Damascus and then went straight down south into Israel, into that land. Does anybody have a question I can refer to Miss Petty? Okay. Yes, yes.
So does that mean they were supposed to have that too?
Apparently. You see where it says the promised land over here, there's a little shaded area there. I'm just taking this for what it's worth as far as what my research gave to me. If you look at Egypt over on the side here, this is unique because if you look at, see where the Suez Canal is, see where Cairo is. If you get on up to the top of Egypt there's a land called Goshen. And that's where the children of Israel were in captivity. You see the area, the era, not the area, but the era that runs across right above the word river. The children of Israel could have come out of the land of Goshen when they were liberated, and in about a week they would have been over into the promised land. But you remember God brought them out and turned them down into the Sinai Peninsula. And Mount Sinai is at the base of that, and that's where he got the law. So the children of Israel then came out of Goshen, turned down south into the Sinai Peninsula, received the law, then turned back up and came in on the Jordan side of the Jordan side of the Jordan River, at a place called Kadesh Barnea. And you remember they sent spies in. 10 were bad and 2 were good. And they rejected it. They basically rejected this. And God turned them back into this wilderness area that you have here in Jordan and going down into Saudi Arabia. And they wandered in that wilderness for 40 years. Until everybody 20 years of age and older died. And then they came back up to the same place 40 years after that at Kadesh Barnea. Okay, anybody else have a question? Okay, I'm going to insult your intelligence today and read you something out of a book. I always hated when teachers did this for me. I always thought, you're unprepared, or else you wouldn't need that book. And this is true. I don't know how many of you have ever read anything by Dave Hunt. Anybody ever read anything by Dave Hunt? Thank you, Miss Lois, because this is her book. I mean, I'm a great bookkeeper. I told her when she gave it to me I was not going to give it back. And she's mumbled something as she walked away. I can't remember what it was. But you didn't mumble anything. Okay. So anyway, I had been reading Dave Hunt for years. I know Miss Lois wouldn't mind me telling you that she has a sister that is in a Mormon church. And Dave Hunt has the best book on Mormonism that you can purchase. It's called The God Makers. If you ever get a chance to pick up a copy of that, you can order it, really. But he also has a number of other books. I'm not going to read how many that he has, but I'm just saying he's in heaven today. I think he died shortly after he wrote this book right here. He was in his 70s then. But this book is called An Urgent Call, and it came to me at exactly the right time I needed it in my life, because it was after I'd had that heart issue, and I was stuck at home, and I read this book through probably at least some parts of it 3 or 4 times. But and when Miss Petty asked the question the other day, I knew. I said, I've read a section about that somewhere. Her question was this: why do they call Israel Palestine? Have you noticed that they do that? When in reality it was never called Palestine to begin with. What was it called initially? You remember? It was called Canaan. Remember when they talked about going into Canaan land? The word Palestine has come up in my lifetime. Actually, goes back about 50 years now when there was a little ratty-looking guy called Yasser Arafat. You remember him? Yasser Ararat is what I always call him, because that's what he looked like. He's dead too. But he, along with some of the other Arabic nations, began to call it Palestine and began to say that the Arabs owned that land because they were of the lineage of Abraham, because they were from Ishmael's side of it. But then that argument falls apart because in the first place, Ishmael's mother was named Hagar, and she was from Egypt. So Ishmael's mother was an Egyptian. She wasn't from Canaan. And of course, Abraham, he was from the Ur of the Chaldees. He was not initially from Canaan. So their claim that the Arabs actually owned that land initially and that Israel was the squatter on that land is not only false, it's unprovable. Also, just from a longevity standpoint, and I'm going to read this to you because he puts it much better than I can put it, but from a longevity standpoint, the nation of Israel with Abraham as its founding father possessed that land some 14 or 1500 years before Christ was born. And the claim of the Arabs to that particular land has only been within the last 40, 50 years, as far as the land being Palestine. So, am I going to insult you if I read to you? Okay, all right, I'm going to read to you. This is from David Hunt, and it's out of the chapter of this book that deals with prophetic proof, page 50 if you ever want to get the book. There are two major topics of prophecy in the Bible. And this is what we're talking about, too, in our lessons. We're talking about God's plan and purpose for the ages. And we recognize that that a lot of prophecy has already been fulfilled. In fact, I believe probably more prophecy has already been fulfilled than is left to be fulfilled. But two major topics of prophecy in the Bible: Israel and the Messiah, who comes to Israel and through Israel to the world. Those two major prophecies. The great prophetic load that you find in here wrapped around either the Messiah or the nation of Israel itself. There are hundreds of prophecies concerning Israel that have been fulfilled, and many more in the process of fulfillment. The fulfillment of prophecies concerning Israel is found throughout vital parts of history, acknowledged by the entire world. And then he gives a brief outline of this. According to the Bible, God gave and incidentally, if people do not hold to the truths of the Scripture, you can't argue with them because their truth base is not there. You know, they say, well, we believe such and so. Well, what is your fact? Is it the Word of God, which has been tested and is completely accurate in every area that it touches on, including geographically, as far as the nations are concerned? In fact, I wrote a little article this last week talking about this matter of abortion. And I made the statement in the article, medical science is continually catching up with what the Bible says. That's the amazing thing about it. Okay, according to the Bible, God gave the land of Israel exclusively to his chosen people, the Jews. It was specifically promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we don't need to read these passages, but because I think we've read them once before. Genesis chapter 12, that's the first of the Abrahamic covenant. I quoted a little bit of it to you. And then you got 2 or 3 sections there in chapter 13, 15, 18, chapter 15, chapter 17, And then in Exodus chapter 6 and 1 Chronicles chapter 16 and on the list goes, that God gave this land specifically to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, who we call the patriarchs, paters, or the founding fathers of the nation of Israel. In fact, you know that Abraham had Isaac. Esau was rejected. You know that Isaac had Jacob. Isaac, I'm getting ahead of myself. Isaac had Jacob, and Esau was rejected. And then Jacob's name was changed to Israel. That's why we call it Israel today. The 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. Israel was the new name given by God to Jacob, and it is from this name that the promised land derives its proper title. When Jacob's name was changed to Israel, which means prince with God, that stamped that name on this land. The importance of these people can be seen in the fact that God tells Moses, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. This is my name forever. This is my memorial unto all generations. The Bible identifies God in this way 12 times. He's the God of Israel. The number of the tribes of Israel, another 203 times he is called the God of Israel. Now here's where we get into the meat of what you asked about last week. Certain Arabs who only within the last 40 years, and this book's 10 years old, only within the last 40 years began to call themselves Palestinians, claimed the land of Israel as the surviving descendants of its original inhabitants. That clearly fraudulent assertion is the basis for their intended displacement of Israel and causes all the conflict in the Middle East. Did you get that sentence? It's really a battle between the Arabic nations that claim that they are from the descendants of Ishmael. Therefore, they have claim to Abraham because they're part of the family. But God rejected Ishmael, you remember. And I should have said this a while ago. When Abraham and Sarah they were getting old, you remember? You remember the history? Couldn't have a child, so Hagar was brought in as a handmaid, and Ishmael was born. God rejected them. And then later on you have it even in the Bible where Hagar and Ishmael, I think it's in the book of Hebrews, that's related, they're related to or epitomize the law. And Isaac, the son of promise, is grace. And so much could be said about that. Certain Arabs who only within the last 50 years, began to call themselves Palestinians, claimed the land of Israel as the surviving descendants of the original inhabitants. That clearly fraudulent assertion is the basis for their intended displacement of Israel and causes a conflict in the Middle East. These Arabs claim that they are descended from Ishmael, Abraham's first son, and that therefore the promised land belongs to them. But Ishmael, even had there been a Palestinian people, was not a Palestinian. This is what we were talking about, Ms. Petty. His mother was Hagar, the Egyptian maid, Genesis 16:1. Of Abraham's wife, Sarah, who, while Ishmael's father was Abraham, who was from Ur of the Chaldees, neither of them were Palestinians. When Abraham brought his wife, servants, and flocks into the promised land that God gave to him and to his heirs by an everlasting covenant, it was called Canaan. Canaan land. We sing that song. The grapes of Escol, grapes of Canaan. And was inhabited by the Canaanites. That's why it was called Canaan land. Arabs who make the impossible claim of descent both from Ishmael and from the original inhabitants of that land are simply lying, and they know it. The land of Canaan to which God brought Abraham became Israel, and we know that when God changed Jacob's name. a great kingdom of the Jewish people for more than 1,500 years. There was no such place, and this relates to what Ms. Petty asked, there was no such place as Palestine, and no such people as Palestinians until the Romans, in anger in AD 135, 1,600 years after the founding, renamed Israel Provincia Syria Palestinia after her chief enemy, the Philistines that lived in that area. You want me to read that to you again? Okay, I will. There was no such place as Palestine and no such people as Palestinians until the Romans, in anger in AD 135. And remember, we talked about the Romans, the Roman government. You have Babylon and Media Persia and Greece and then Rome. And Rome took the land in 60 BC, 60 years before Christ was born. And Rome ruled until 400 AD. So about 135 AD, Rome, there was uprisings with the Philistines that were in that area. Rome hated the Philistines, and in anger in AD 135, renamed Israel, that land that was called Israel for all those years, Provincia, or the province of Syria, Palestina, or Syria and the Philistines, after her chief enemies, the Philistines. Therefore, its inhabitants were called Palestinians, because they were of that of the Philistines. An appellation which the Arabs steadfastly refused, insisting that the Jews were the Palestinians. It was not until the early 1960s that certain Arabs began to claim that they were indeed Palestinians and that the Jews were occupying the land that they had inherited from ancient ancestors. On the contrary, God told Abraham specifically that Isaac, his son by Sarah, and his descendants would inherit the promised land. The earliest verses, and Dave Hunt brings this out, the earliest verses in the Quran support the writings of Moses. To escape the honest consequence of that embarrassing fact, Islam claims that the Bible was subsequently corrupted, a claim for which no evidence can be offered. In fact, we have Torah is the law, Torah manuscripts, both before and after Muhammad, and they are identical. The Quran itself declares repeatedly that Allah, which is what they call God, Jehovah God, brought the Jews out of slavery in Egypt, destroying Pharaoh's pursuing army, gave Israel the promised land, and brought them into it. So this whole thing has snowballed, and one of the reasons why it has snowballed is because of liberal politicians. And even back in the late 60s and early 70s when all of this, you remember every president would put their hat in their hand and try to solve the problem of war in the Middle East, everyone. You remember Jimmy Carter would go over there, and Bill Clinton went over there, and each one of them, because that was the big feather in the cap, if you could solve this. And so the Arabic people, these Yasser Arafat and this whole group of the Arabs, there was no giving with them. So to solve it, what happened was they began to whittle away at what Israel had geographically until they've been doing this all along. Now you've got the same thing on the Golan Heights and the other areas. And that, I didn't mean to bore you. You have your hand up.
Yeah, I can remember you watching the news and them building a wall or having some sort of wall where they were trying to make peace and treaty between the Palestinians and the Jews. Remember that?
Israel has always had a wall. They got a great wall. In fact, President Trump has shown a lot of pictures of Israel's wall. I understand Miss Pelosi has one around her house. Yes, ma'am.
That sentence you read about Rome renaming it
Yeah.
would explain why in my Bible, the map of the days of Jesus' life says it's a map of Israel in the days of Palestine, or Palestine
Yeah.
in the days of Jesus. Because I thought, well, why was it called that back then if it's only been the Palestinians? And then the other thing is there anything, the Bible talks about the 6 other sons of Abraham with his third
Yes.
son slash wife, Keturah.
Yeah.
He sent them, it says, to the east. Was there a land given to them? It says he gave them gifts, I'm assuming.
Probably wasn't land.
They didn't really own that.
No.
So he just sent them away.
Right. And
So they would not be considered Palestinians because they weren't Ishmael, if that were.
no, and that was some 1,500 years before it was even actually called Palestine. And you have to keep in mind that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they weren't landowners. They were nomadic sheep herders. They raised sheep and camels and some cattle and that kind of thing. But what they would do is set their tent up, and they'd graze the area around their tent, and then they'd pick the tent up and move somewhere else. And they did this over and over again. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, sometimes they'd build a well, they'd stay there for a little while. And so this is the reason why that God sent them down to Egypt, because he knew if he left them alone as nomadic people, they would scatter to the 4 winds, just like you were talking about the rest of Abraham's sons. He sent them away. So what God did was he sent Joseph down into Egypt, into captivity, and then started a famine. We're talking about God's plan and purpose for the ages. Started a famine, and the rest of the brothers had to go down. And you remember Joseph made himself known to them, and then they were about to starve to death. So Joseph said, "Go back, get our father, and bring everybody down to Egypt." And they stayed in Egypt in the land of Goshen. And they stayed there for until the good Pharaoh that loved Joseph died, and an evil Pharaoh took over, and they put him into captivity. But the reason why they put him into captivity was this was God's plan, because now they're fenced in. They can't pick their tents up and move. They're working in the brick kilns. And as a result of that, it turned out 70 souls at the end of 430 years became we think 2 million people, some 600,000 men. God made a nation, but he contained the people of Israel so that he could make that nation out. And when they walked out of the land of Egypt, they walked out as a solid nationalistic a nation that has retained its nationalistic identity even to this day. Even when they were put into Babylon, they were still Jews. You send them to Russia, they're still Jews, Russian Jews. They're Jews in America. So our time's gone. Next week we'll do something different. I don't know what yet.